Albana did a great job in explaining us the radiobiology, and now the question is, how do we use this knowledge and implement this into a treatment planning system to basically account for this pronounced nonlinear biological effects in treatment planning? And I directly started my presentation with the first most important slide. So this is what you will learn in the next couple of minutes. So on the left side, you see a spread out Bragg peak of protons where we optimized the physical dose. So here with these gray thin lines, you see the dose distribution of the individual pencil beams that have been differently modulated, so with different fluences. And if you sum them up, then you end up with the black solid line. And in this case, the plan was optimized for 3 gray. And for protons, we have this linear dose mapping. So we have this uppercase D matrix, which is the dose influence matrix. And this is actually being computed if you press in Matrat the calc dose influence matrix button. So then Matrat computes for each pencil beam the dose distribution for unit intensity. And in optimization, you basically try to find weights such that the resulting dose distribution fits your clinical needs. And what's being characteristic for this concept is that this is a linear operation. Whereas if we go to biological treatment planning, then we have a linear quadratic dose mapping. And this essentially relates back to the linear quadratic model that Albano was mentioning before. And so what you see here now on the lower right plot is a spread out Bragg peak of carbon ions that for which a biological optimization was performed. Again, so here, I hope you can see these thin gray lines are the individual physical dose distributions of the pencil beams. If you add them up, then you obtain the black solid line, the total physical dose. And due to these nonlinear biological effects, you end up with a homogeneous RBE weighted dose given here in blue. So I called it RBE weighted dose, which is another acronym to BED, biological effective dose. So this is essentially, yeah, the biological effective dose. And so you can see, and the ratio between the biological effective dose or RBE weighted dose to the physical dose, which is the black line here, is given by the RBE. And the RBE is represented here in red. And as you can see, it strongly varies across the penetration depth and reaches its peak in the fall-off region. And if you basically multiply the physical dose with the RBE, you end up with the RBE weighted dose. And this is ultimately the quantity that's relevant for biological treatment planning, because this basically, you have to apply to the patient that the black physical dose to achieve the same effect as if you would apply 3 gray of photons. And this is what needs to be accounted for in treatment planning. So how do we get there? This is the question. So again, a small recap, and this cannot be mentioned enough times. So the RBE is the ratio of the physical photon dose divided by the physical ion dose, given they are isoeffective. And as we have just heard, for carbon ions, it turns out that we need less physical dose to achieve the same cell killing compared to photons. So for photons, in this very simplistic example, we would almost need twice the dose to achieve the same cell survival. And basically, the cell survival curve is parameterized by 2 parameters, the alpha and beta parameter, and they describe the cell survival. And we consider them as radiosensitivity parameters. And we need to have them in order to make the relation back to photons, from carbon ions to photons. And what's also important to keep in mind, which has also already been pointed out, that there are also different tissue types, and different tissue types possess different radiosensitivities. So in the photon world, this is just also now a synthetic example, we might have an alpha-beta ratio of 2 and 10, which are characterized by these 2 lines. And in this case, the alpha-beta ratio of 10 is more sensitive to radiation than the alpha-beta ratio of 2. And these parameters, they are historically based, well known or better known in the photon world. The question is now, how can we derive the radiosensitivity parameters of carbon ions. And this is also what I will going to talk about. But to basically derive these parameters for carbon ions, we have to take one step back. So we have to look at first some basics. So here we see the depth dose profile of a carbon ion beam. And when we're shooting carbons into tissue or water, then it starts to fragment into lighter ions. And all these lines, they also contribute to in red. And you can see the main part of those is given by the primary carbons, but there are also some lighter fragments that even penetrate deeper beyond the Bragg peak, so to say, and they contribute to the dose tail. So the carbon ions, they produce fragments. And now here we look at fluence. So the fluence, the number of particles as a function of the penetration depth. And what you see here now is that the carbon ions, in this case, for this energy, they stop around 15 centimeter in water. And there are, again, these lighter fragments, which basically have the ability to penetrate deeper tissues. And to further add another complexity to the situation, we also have a energy spectrum. So each particle could have a specific energy. And here I'll just show you the energy spectrum at the depth of, at exactly this depth of 15 centimeters. So in this location where the carbon ions are stopping, we have the following energy distribution of the different fragments. And since the carbon ions are stopping over here, you see that the energy is low, whereas for the lighter ions, the energy is higher. And now when we think of biological treatment planning, and in this case, I'm setting a focus on carbon ion treatment planning, then the question is, what is the cell survival of all these fragments, which all have a different energy? And this is basically a key question, and this is also what I'm going to present you. So the overall radiosensitivity of this carbon ion beam is a function of the beam energy, the initial beam energy itself. It's also a function of the penetration depth. And then it's also a function of the radiosensitivity of all individual fragments, which in turn depend on the energy. And now the question is, well, how do we get these parameters? Because we need them to perform our treatment planning, to account for these effects. And so, as I've just pointed out, these radiosensitivity parameters, they possess various dependencies. So the initial beam energy, the depth, fragment, stopping power, and also the cell type. And so there are, like, as Nicholas was saying, I think the curse of dimensionality a couple of days ago. So there are, like, the combinatorics to cover all these different combinations. This would be a huge effort to perform, for instance, clonogenic cell line experiments for all these combinations would take a lot of time, given that, yeah, having access to a carbon ion facility is a limited resource. So therefore, historically, there was the need to develop biophysical models to predict the radiosensitivity of all these combinatorics. There are some scare in vivo and in vitro experiments, and the models are basically have been validated with this scare data. But more importantly, these biophysical models are also able to predict combinations for which we don't have basically experimental data. This is the underlying idea. And here is just one example where I show you the output of the local effect model 1, and the tissue is characterized by the photon reference parameters alpha x and beta x, so alpha beta ratio of 2. And here you see now the radiosensitivity for different fragments as a function of energy. And this is basically now the biological base data. And once you have this, you can now perform radiation treatment planning for carbon ions. And to do so, there are two different approaches. And the first approach, I called it full simulation, which is a bit more complex. And it involves a two-step sampling process. So just imagine if you shoot in multiple pencil beams, multiple carbon ion pencil beams into a patient, then you have fragments of your pencil beam, of your first pencil beam, fragments of your second pencil beam, and so forth. So at the end, you have a very complex mixed radiation fields, and therefore you have to sample, in this case, you sample the number of cell hits according to the local particle fluence. And then you calculate the biological effect using the local effect model, so this biological base data, and you know basically what fragments you have at that very position inside your patient, and you know the local energy spectrum. And from there, you calculate the biological effect for each fragment. You add it up to derive the total biological effect, accounting for all your fragments. And then you reproduce this a couple of times to get a robust value and to also basically allow for different particle combinations. And this is very accurate and works also for arbitrary dose levels. However, one problem here is that it needs to be done or redone if the pencil beam intensities change. And you already know, like, that during optimization, in each iteration, we change the pencil beam intensities. And if you remember from some of the optimizations we did, typically we run like 100, 200, or even 300 iterations until the treatment plan fits our clinical needs. And if we would run now a full simulation for the biological optimization, and in each iteration, we would have to repeat this procedure. And this is very, very time consuming. So because of that reason, the researchers at the GSI facility proposed an analytical approximation and a beam mixing model to basically overcome this computational challenge. And here this analytical approximation is only valid in the low dose regime, so for fractional dose levels below 10 gray. And in such scenarios, the cell hit probability reduces to a single hit, and the base data I was showing on the previous slide basically can be transformed using this single hit probability. And then this can be combined. So this updated, or this updated biological base data can now be combined with your treatment planning system. And what you have to do now is basically for each carbon energy that you have available in your treatment planning system, from 50 to 400 MeV, you have to run a Monte Carlo simulation to score the total dose distribution, the fluence, the energy spectra, and then you can compute a biological base data set. And this is exemplary shown here for the alpha parameter for one specific beam energy. And you basically apply some dose averaging over the different fragments, and then you come up with this line. And so at the end, these biological depth dose profiles are called depth-dependent dose averaged radiosensitivity parameters. And if you do that now for every carbon ion energy, you basically end up with 3 curves per energy. And this is what's showing here. So for each energy in our treatment planning system, again, I showed here for 277 MeV, I have a physical dose profile and a alpha carbon and a beta carbon profile. And these are the radiosensitivity parameter, so to say, for this carbon ion beam, that already account for all the biological effects of the fragments. And also, I have to say that these curves are only valid for one specific tissue type. Different tissue types, you get a new triplet of curves, so to say. So once you have this, you can then actually start treatment planning. And one good thing about this is, I also have to mention, that you only have to basically calculate these curves once. Once you have them, you can apply it in treatment planning for every patient. So these are, because in treatment planning, you always convert the patient to a water equivalent densities, and then you perform those calculation in water. So back to the famous equation of the RBE, where we have basically the physical dose of photons divided by the physical ion dose, given they are isoeffective. Now, if you relate them to each other, you can basically derive the following equation that I'm showing here below. which is the RBE weighted dose, is a function of a square root of epsilon, and epsilon is now the biological effect. This is the most important part, and this is also basically highlighted here in the second equation. So this is the interesting part. Here we have our carbon ion based data that's coming into play. The remaining parameters are simply constants and refer to the photon world. So we have now to compute these parameters for each pencil beams during treatment planning. And to do so, we use a very similar concept as we already did for the physical dose. So for the physical dose, we were using this dose influence concept. And now we apply this to the radiosensitivity parameters. And to do so, we compute alpha and beta influence matrices for each pencil beam. And this is basically given here then by this equation. So the J refers or loops sums over all pencil beam intensities. So in addition to our physical dose, we now have an alpha IJ matrix, which contains the linear part of our biological effect. And we also have the beta part. And for both, we compute the influence matrix. And since we can also directly combine them to minimize the computational effort, we end up with only two matrices in this case. And once we have that, we can easily compute or re-evaluate the biological effect during optimization if we change the pencil beam intensities. And once we have basically then optimized our biological effect, we can then convert it back to the RBE weighted dose by simply taking the square root and applying these constants. So the biological effect is just the intermediate quantity for treatment plan optimization. In MATCHOT, you can also directly optimize on the RBE. There are only very marginal differences in different trade-offs. But yeah, what's important to know is that you basically in biological treatment planning, you apply a very similar concept, which is the influence concept that allows you then to run our optimization very effectively, because you have to re-evaluate your biological effect in each iteration for different pencil beam widths. All right, so coming back to our first slide, I hope you now understand a bit better that when we do carbon ion treatment planning, that things become more complex, and that instead of a linear dose mapping, we now have a linear quadratic dose mapping, or a linear quadratic mapping to derive the biological effect. And from the biological effect, we simply take the square root and apply some constants to then derive the biological effective dose, the RBE weighted dose. And this is basically given here. You can see here in green the biological effect that's being optimized in the background. And once it's finished, it's simply being converted to the RBE weighted dose. So I have two more slides. So as of now, I was mainly focusing on carbon ions. And for carbon ions, there have been these biophysical models, such as the local effect model, the repair-misrepair fixation model, and the microdosimetric kinect model. So there are different biophysical models that can predict the radiosensitivity of carbon ions and its fragments, so to say. And like in the latest versions, they are also capable to do that for lighter ions. This is basically what I'm representing here. But in addition to that, for protons and helium ions, there are also, the situation becomes less complex, so to speak, less fragments. There are also analytical fits to in vitro data, where these radiosensitivity parameters, alpha for photons and helium, are simply derived from analytical fits accounting for the LET and the photon reference parameters. And the simplest is, for protons, is the constant RBE of 1.1. The constant RBE of 1.1 is only used for protons. But as you can see here, these analytical fits, so we can also derive radiosensitivity parameters for protons and do variable RBE treatment planning for protons. But this has to be treated with caution, since all this data is mainly based on in vitro data, and it's still questionable if these in vitro cell line measurements directly refer to the in vivo situation. But long story short, I want to show you now an overview of the different radiation modalities so basically on the upper left plot, you see our water box phantom, and I basically irradiate this inner squared area here with protons, and I was optimizing it for a physical dose of 2 gray. And now I was recalculating the biological effective dose using a RBE model for protons. So here we have a variable RBE, and what you can see is now that the resulting dose is inhomogeneous and it's increasing towards the distal end of the SOBP. So we have a higher dose here before the protons stop. And this is just to show you the biological effect of different radiation modalities. But again, for protons, it has to be treated with caution. We can do the same for helium ions. So here on the upper plot, you see now again the physical dose that has been optimized for helium ions. And then in the lower plot, we basically take the physical dose and apply a biophysical model. And then we see that if we believe this model, then we overdose our tumor here in this region. So we again have a nonlinear RBE, and this results in an increased biological effective dose in the distal edge of our spread out bragg peak. And last but not least, to complete the picture, I show you now here on the upper right corner a carbon ion treatment plan, and I was again ignoring all radiobiological factors and was simply optimizing the physical dose also to 2 gray, and was then applying the local effect model to that physical fluences. And in this case, it becomes most dramatic because of this high RBE that we have with carbon ions. We have doses here at the very end of our target of up to 5 gray. And so summarized, this is to show you that for heavier charged particles, the biological effects become more pronounced, and it's when you look at carbon ions, it's essential that you incorporate these nonlinear biological effects in treatment planning, because you simply cannot apply such a physical dose to the patient. You need to incorporate these biological effects. And with that, yeah, I am at the end of my talk.
Okay, thank you very much, Hans-Peter, for that very interesting talk. We will now move on to questions before moving on to lunch. I'll leave it in your hands.
Yeah, so first question, neutrons. Yes, there are some studies which also look at the neutron dose, but yeah, I would recommend to do a Google search on that. But in the classical standard biological treatment planning, neutron dose is not considered. The second question, do you take into account the radiosensitivity alpha beta parameters in the lateral plane of the beam in the GPS? No, we do not. We assume that the radiosensitivity is laterally constant, so it only varies in depth. How to calculate RBE from epsilon? So the epsilon is the biological effect, and then maybe I can just throw in my slide one more time. So here you have the biological effect. This is the epsilon, and then maybe let's move over to this equation. Here we have the biological effect divided by beta x. Apply this term, and later on you subtract this term. But these are all like constants, so to say. Alpha x is 0.1 and beta x might be 0.02, and that's it. So this is straightforward, so to say. Can you bring up the questions again, the Google Doc? How much RBE for proton can be different from mean values? It's always difficult to answer such general questions. It depends on it depends very much on the tissue itself. But if we believe the variable RBE models that again have been mostly validated with in vitro data, then the RBE increases towards the distal edge of the SOBP and might reach values of 1.3, 1.4, and slightly lower values below 1.1 in the proximal region. But I think, yeah, clinical wise, I think we're not far off the mean value of 1.1. And also, I mean, as of now, there is, I guess, but I'm also not an expert on this, but what I know so far, there's not enough justification to use to move to a variable RBE model for protons. All right, any other questions? Yeah.
Are there any other questions? Okay, I encourage you to please fill in the poll. And unless I see any other questions, okay, we can move on to lunch. So Hans-Peter, thank you so much for your presentation and for answering the questions. We will have the opportunity to meet Hans-Peter even in the afternoon in the discussion session. Okay, so we now move on to lunch, and we will see you later on in the afternoon for the rest of the sessions. We will come back at 2 o'clock for the hands-on part of today's school. Thank you and hope you have a good lunch.